Sure, of course. So I traveled around a lot growing up internationally for my father's corporate job. Not a missionary, not military, just corporate America. And ended up at high school in Phoenix. Everyone asks how I ended up at Wheaton. I'm not entirely sure, but it just became very obvious that's where I was going. So I went to Wheaton and then studied theology and English at Wheaton. I had a wonderful time and decided at the end to go to theological seminary. It was a very practical decision in a lot of ways. I loved studying theology, had a great scholarship. The recession hit. It made a lot of sense to be in a 3-year grad program. So that's how I ended up in New Jersey. And actually got connected to time within about 3 weeks of starting, which is very unusual. I had no idea I was going to be a journalist, didn't know any journalists, didn't really know what a journalist did. But I met our then Nation editor when she was speaking at the university about the 2008 presidential campaign. And she was talking about the role of young evangelicals in the changing political scene across the country. So I ended up talking with her afterwards, asked her for a job, and then that next summer I started working for Time. So you're very sweet, brought my article. Thank you, I'm very honored. Anyway, and so my time in seminary was very tailored towards this idea that I had that I was going to go into media. No one really from Princeton Seminary, I don't know what it is at the seminary here, but the media experience is not very prominent on campus. But because I knew that's what I wanted to do, I took certain classes and just really thought, what do I need to know now to make my reporting even stronger? And that's basically how it happened. I was working part-time for Time the last sort of year and a half while I was in grad school, which worked out. I was very glad when it was over because it's hard to do full-time school and working for a national news magazine. But I went to Washington, D.C. I was based mostly out of D.C. throughout that time for Time. And then basically started writing and started as a reporter, doing, I'd say probably more than half at the beginning, maybe 60% of my portfolio was actually politics, 40% faith, and then for a variety of reasons, we didn't have someone really focusing on faith, and so then that's flip-flopped. And now I'd say, I'm a correspondent, but I do probably 80% religion, all religion. I think Pope Francis has helped me out in that regard. And then about 20% other news. But religion tends to be a religion and faith, religion and politics, religion and history, religion and education, culture, foreign policy, domestic policy. So it's really fun. And I really enjoy it. We'll see how the portfolio shifts again when we're back in campaign season, which it's more than 2 years away, but we think it's now, so that's how I ended up at Time. So cover stories happen in different ways. Most often, you never know it's a cover story until until I know the button has been pressed, it's going to the printer. And then I actually wait a couple of hours because I've been in situations where there's some, breaking news in the middle of the night and we pull a whole issue, and we redo the whole issue. Steve Jobs, that happened, we published on Wednesday night. He died and we did a whole other magazine in 4 hours. So usually in this particular case is my first really big project for Time. We have a lot of autonomy as reporters in what we cover. We're responsible to tell our editors what the news is and why should Time be covering it. So I started in August of 2012, right during the campaign, on this story. And I mostly was curious. I was looking for a story to do that focused on the Latino community, but was not a political story and was not an immigration story. The coverage nationally at that point, especially with the election, had really been focused on that angle. And it's a giant community with lots of other elements, so we thought, and the message from the top was, look for something else, religion's a great focus. So the reporting really started with just an experience. And I was explaining to the seminar this morning, but amid all of the hundreds of campaign signs, local, state, national, that were covering or littering the streets, whichever you prefer, little squares stuck in the ground, I started seeing signs in Spanish for iglesias and arrows and phone numbers, and thinking, what's going on here? So I started following them, trying to figure out where these signs were going, why they were there, what they meant. And then I started to see vans. Why are there vans with Spanish writing for churches and phone numbers? And once your eyes get tuned to see those images, I started seeing them everywhere. Now I have this fun little personal collection of van photos and signed photos from the beginnings of this project. And so then I just started trying to find the churches and going to them. So for about 6 months, I spent 2 to 3 Sundays a month, really, in Latino Protestant churches. And about a month and a half in, I selected 2 in Maryland. I was living in Virginia at the time, but for a variety of reasons selected the 2 featured stories in the cover article. They were in Maryland. I picked them for different reasons. I wanted to show the different stages of what we ended up calling the Latino Reformation. So I picked a first generation church, mostly second generation church, and then eventually, once we realized the really national scope of the story we were on to, I went out to Chicago and spent some time with one of the largest Latino evangelical megachurches in the country, New Life Covenant. And so the story came, I just spent time with people, and they invited me in to hear their stories. There was a huge desire to be listened to, and I took that seriously. And my sort of theory as a journalist is you follow your gut, that you spend a lot of time listening, and usually whatever anyone else has to say is more interesting than what I want to ask them about, and then I listen for the story that they're telling, and then try to guide my questions from there. And then once I had so much reporting on this. I mean, when you do that kind of project, you have lots of information. And I have a very wise editor who understood the story. He got it. He knew it was a national trend. He knew it was really important. And they put it on the cover. It's my first cover story. It is a breathless sprint. However, it's also, there are very few projects that my colleagues do that have that amount of time. I mean, I've turned another cover story around in 36 hours. So it's a huge luxury to have that kind of time and to have an editor who will say, that's okay. I mean, it helped too, it was on the weekend, so I was kind of spending my own time doing that. Yeah. But I'd say in this particular case, there actually weren't a lot of experts, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited for the seminar. Because I actually found out about this whole seminar and the Fellows Program, Googling about it a year after the story came out, because I thought, I wonder what's happened in a year. I just couldn't believe it. Wait, this exists now? I mean, this is so exciting that there's a group of people who are going to be devoting time and resources to the same thing that I was trying to do, I mean, if I had had that a year ago, it would have been a much different kind of story, right? I would have called people from the seminar and said, tell me about your churches. But instead it was reporter driven. And the data was really difficult on this story. It's actually one of the hang-ups in the end about like how to publish it and how to frame it, because there really wasn't a lot of hard data. The biggest study at the time was a 2007 Pew Research Center study, which they just redid this summer. The results came out this summer. So we finally have a comparative 5 or 6 or 7 year span to see what's happened, which confirmed everything in the story. Always makes me very happy. Wave that one around. Made my editors very happy. So it was an unusual case. I mean, having had some background and a degree in understanding church communities, that helped. I did a lot of book reading. I never read books really for journalism. You don't have that time. You just call the author and ask for a 20-minute explainer. But I was reading books, histories of Latin America. Just a lot. It was much more historical. And then it's first-person interviews. I mean, it's devoting the time to interviewing people. And then learning, you spot trends. I mean, if you ask how I knew it was a national story, I don't think I knew at the beginning, but you start to see the trends, and you start to see something that I also realized that Times audience had not been exposed to before in a real and deep way. And so that made me say, that means it's a time story too, like I could write this. But then it was also, well, no one else had written about it in a deep way either, so that's how I knew we were on to something. I'm going to answer that in 2 parts. One, I'm going to give you my cop-out answer, which is the cover story is the single story that came out of that, because there are so many individual narratives along the way, not just individual church narratives, but the individuals in the congregations. So being able to synthesize that into what the national single storyline is, I'd say that's the cover. But I can tell you a few of the personal stories that stand out to me when I look back on this experience. Because it's not just a reported experience, it also, because I spent so much time doing it, I mean, I met people, I heard their stories, and it made an impression on me as a person. That's the other thing. You ask, what makes it, how do you know you have a story? Whenever something moves you personally and you keep thinking about it, that's how you know you have a bigger story too. So, and forgive me if I'm repeating a couple of these little stories that might be in the cover, I don't know. One, I remember very distinctly meeting with, I think the experience of poverty and the isolation, the economic isolation that a lot of the first generation churches that I was engaging with, that they were experiencing, that made a pretty big impression. I mean, I would be at a church for 5 or 6 hours, and in between multiple services, sometimes, well, not sometimes, every time they would offer me food, every time. And we would go downstairs to a hall, maybe half the size of this. Flags are, from all of home countries are lining the space. Kids are running around, and the pastor and the pastor's family would be taking a break at like a little nap area, because they're there for a whole time. So they would have like a little nap area, they had a little prayer area, they had a little kitchen. And once they started realizing that I was coming, I mean, every time we would sit down and they would bring me food, and they would make me, I remember this one time being handed a ham and cheese sandwich, just like a piece of ham and a piece of cheese on white bread, and they gave it to me, and then everyone else ate ramen. And I was like, you can't, and I'm just here working. Like, so I gave half the sandwich to the pastor, we had a big fight about who was gonna eat the sandwich. And that moment captured for me the generosity of the church, the hospitality, the compassion for the stranger, the church was the place. It wasn't just a spiritual experience. I mean, this is where people were eating. I mean, and then sometimes someone would be making making tamales throughout the 3-hour service, and then afterwards the whole congregation would come down and everyone would eat. But then in another church, they would say, we can't, or it was the same church, that same pastor said, we can't stand up on Sunday and say if anyone has a need, come and tell us, because there will be a line out the door. And he wasn't joking. He said, but we know everyone's needs. I mean, they know, and they said if we know that someone doesn't have any food or their fridge is empty, we will not sleep until we know that they've eaten. And that whole experience made a very profound impression on me. And another one, during one of the services, the kids were downstairs and they were coloring for part of the service. I mean, the services were long, so 4 hours, so kids would be running around and waving flags, and they'd also sometimes be coloring downstairs. And I was there with one of our photographers that time. Great guy, Ricardo. Everyone loved Ricardo way more than they loved me. And he was running around kind of playing with the kids when he wasn't shooting pictures. And they were like, what's your name? And this is all in Spanish. And they're like, well, what's your name? What's your name? And he's like, Obama. Wow, Obama, Obama, Obama. And everyone's laughing. Your name's not Obama, blah, blah, blah. And then this 5-year-old kid, coloring, says, Obama, can you give me a resident? Just like that. Like, the grammar was wrong, and the room stopped. All the kids stopped. We're talking 3 to 7-year-old. Everyone just stopped. The teenage helper stopped, and they all stared at me. And and then he kind of like, what did I do? But the topic of immigration is not something that was talked about a lot in the worship experience, but that moment it made so clear to me. I mean, this is just never far from anyone's mind. And that congregation probably, I'd say, maybe upwards of 60, 70, maybe even 80% undocumented. This is a first-generation church. And I mean, how does a 5-year-old kid know that, hey, if Obama's here, he can help? He doesn't even know what a residency is, probably. He knew resident. He knew how to say resident. So he knew that was something. He knew he needed it. And it was just so out of the mouths of babes. So I'd say some of those things kind of capture some of the broader storyline that I saw throughout my time. So, first off, I'd say that it tended to be the church congregations tended to be divided over size and broader community presence outside the core attendees or congregants was often related to how long the church members and the church leadership had been in the country. So the first generation and second generation churches tended to be more hidden from me, hidden from other mainstream white and black churches in the area, whereas by the time you get to Pastor Choco's church in Chicago, 17,000 people, they've been there a lot longer. He's been there a lot longer than pastors before him in his family, and so I'd say the broader cultural assimilation is related to that. I'll leave that to dissect even more what exactly that means and what that looks like. But even some of the more hidden churches were quite large. That's another thing that was surprising. And they'd have a very small physical space, if they had any physical space at all. You couldn't find them in the phone book or online until you started looking on YouTube or on Facebook with certain keywords in Spanish and cities associated. That's how I ended up finding it. It's not just like the normal Google search algorithms that tend to work for maybe a lot of the churches here in Grand Rapids. But once I would go, I mean, it would be 400 people. I mean, the average church size in America is pretty small. I mean, someone probably knows this off the top of their head more than I do. I'm going to throw out a number like around 50 people, I mean, average, all the little churches. I mean, that's probably even big. But I'm talking like 300 or 400 people. I mean, they're doubling in size too. I mean, so over the last several years since they've started, we would go from 50 people, 100 people, 200 people, 400 people. I mean, the growth is really exponential, and you don't necessarily see it in the same way because you're not driving by and seeing 400 cars in a parking lot. But you go in, or then you see families, multi-generational families walking together to a bus stop, or eventually all converging on this one place. I'd separate that into a couple different questions. One, television, televangelism, radio evangelism is one of the things that some of the historians I spoke with were explaining that really the Latino Reformation, the Protestant Reformation happened, or really only came to Latin, Central and South America in the 70s. Someone here might want to correct me on that, but that's what I quoted. It said it was really, versus you think of Europe, and the Protestant Reformation happened in Europe several hundred years prior, but it was much more linked in Latin communities to televangelism and to the technology that was inspiring that kind of change. It wasn't the Gutenberg Bible, it was televangelists, right? So that transition then was as the migration patterns happening coming north, that's why we're starting to see in recent decades the Latino Reformation happening here, or we're seeing some of that. So that's one part of how television was involved. In terms of patterns of media consumption and use by these communities, I'd say radio was actually a huge thing. People listening to radio programs, obviously in Spanish. I'm talking the first and second generation communities. They had pastors they listened to, teachings they listened to on the radio. And then there was a lot of streaming of their own services back to some of their home communities, which I thought was fascinating because you initially think, or my initial thought was that maybe these communities wouldn't be as technologically savvy, but no, I mean the graphics, I mean it was like it's big screens, lots of graphics, lots of direct streaming, people at home in Honduras and watching on YouTube. And it seemed to be an emphasis on where their priorities were and where they weren't going to necessarily make this really amazing website, but people weren't coming to their church because they looked it up on a website and wanted to go visit it. They were coming because someone, that they met offered for them to live in their room while they were trying to find a job, and then would give them food, or the church would come by and be like, do you need clothing? And then they would come. So they didn't need that. What they needed was, or that's another, Facebook was actually, I found more communities on Facebook because I would imagine the social connections there were stronger. And the same with YouTube. So it was just, you had to figure out where to look for that. I mean, this is a huge point, and it's absolutely true. And I think that, so the new Pew study that came out just last month actually breaks some of this down by country of origin, which was really helpful and deserves even further study, I think, because I picked the churches that I could really because I needed time to do this project, and I needed be able to get there. So the countries of origin tended to be more Central America, and that's how I ended up there. I think it was very different in Florida, very different in Southwest, and also when you think of, I mean, a lot of these churches where I went, they're not really connected structurally to denominations. Even if they might affiliate or say they'd affiliate, it's not the same kind of thing. You know, it was a Four-Square church, Assemblies of God, but even that's very loose. It's not like it was planted. Whereas the Southern Baptists out west, you know, Richard Land, who was leading the Southern Baptists for a while, I think some of the Religious Liberties Commission told me, you drive west on Highway 10, and every town you go through there's a Baptist church with the Iglesia Bautista attached to it. And so they've had, because the immigration patterns have been different and the history there has been different in terms of just people living there for hundreds of years, the churches have grown in different ways, and the Catholic Church is responding to it in different ways regionally, right? So in LA and in Arizona, I think the bishops have a much better grasp of what their congregations need, where the growth is and isn't happening, and what tools there. So I also went to some Catholic churches in Maryland just to kind of compare, and it would not have been the same experience as being out west. I mean, I think the same is true in Florida, where you have a really strong Cuban presence. And I think, so I know in Florida is where there's several women, some of the largest Latino Protestant congregations in the country. And I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, even in Maryland, husbands and wives co-lead often the churches. I mean, women are preaching. That's one area where I found the churches to be very progressive. Whereas no one drinks, no one smokes, no one does any drugs. I mean, you'd expect the drugs, but I mean, it's a very conservative social ethic. But women can preach, right? So I think definitely, and it's something that they talked about too. Their country of origin and how they were navigating that, creating their new community together, but what were the influences that brought them to where they are. Well, I know political operatives, I mean, this is the Latino vote is a big thing. Everyone wants it. So it was interesting seeing who was actually picking up on the nuances of the story, because I think one of the things, and I've written about it as follow-ups throughout the past years, kind of watching, I think the conservative social morals of a lot of the evangelical Latino community, and I use evangelical and charismatic and Pentecostal clustered together for a variety of reasons. I know it's going to make a lot of people frustrated, but I mean, when I would ask, there's a lot of self-definition, and a lot of Anglo-North American, Western scholarship has separated those categories a lot, whereas I found they didn't. I mean, I would try to ask, you know, do you define yourself as an evangelical or charismatic? And they're like, it's the same thing. Like, what are you talking about? So, and that has to do with the history and the theological history of Latin and South America. Also, it's changing as communities really get rooted in the United States. That's a slight digression. What that means is the GOP here tends to think that conservative evangelicals vote with them. And I think that once the immigration issue really is settled, which probably won't be in this Congress, but you know, we'll see what happens. I think that there is a lot of potential for that community to start voting with the GOP, and that's not something that I think was on everyone's radar. I mean, the Democrats really think, oh, Latino community, we got this because of immigration. But it's much more complicated than that, and it's a state-by-state issue depending on where people are coming from. That's a whole set of implications that people are still very interested in. And I mean, even a 1% the numbers game in politics, you want to win, percents matter. So if you can shave off, that slice of the Latino evangelical community for your side, it's a big deal. But other reactions, I actually think it was a pretty big story for the Latino community. I mean, the churches they were so happy to be heard. And that's always very gratifying when you tell someone's story who hasn't felt welcomed. And I mean, it's a statement. I mean, I'm pretty sure that it's framed like in the hall lobby of the church. It's kind of hilarious. And then we named the pastor of the church in Chicago, Pastor Choco, to the Time 100. So that was a further, we put our stamp on, this is a national story to be paid attention to. And that's very special. In terms of push, I always also look for pushback. I say you've done your job right when you're getting kind of pushback from multiple sides. It's not just everyone's happy. A few people, and this is much smaller level, but I got into it on Twitter with a few people, were concerned. I said in the story, talking about the understanding of the miraculous in these congregations. I said something after going into all of the miracles all the time. I said, it can tread on some shaky theological ground. And there was major pushback. How can you say that? And I really felt like I said it because the churches, these churches that I was focusing on, the church is becoming the healthcare center. I mean, how do you negotiate and think through the implications of that? And if you don't have healthcare, I mean, there's so many factors that are creating this and making this an issue, and then you're starting to see the theology self-reinforce. That's what I was seeing, and I think that's something to take seriously. I appreciate the question. One of my challenges as a journalist is that it's just me doing religion for time, really. And I have my colleagues, they're ace reporters. They can be thrown into any story, even a religion story, and report it like nobody's business. I mean, they're good. One of the things that would be helpful for me, I can't do this cover. I can't do that all the time. How am I going to do that? I have so much I'm trying to do. But you all are probably doing things like that a lot and writing about it. And often the writing takes place in longer analysis, big books, things like that. And I think I've sort of thought of it as a resource question. I mean, the goals of academic writing are different from my goals as a journalist, and the way storytelling happens is different. But I would say, write whatever you're writing, this long thing, write it in 700 words. I mean, I know I did academic writing, I understand that's kind of terrifying, and it's actually really hard to do, but you can do it. If you have any idea that you have, I really think, this is bold, but any idea someone has is really worth having. If you can, it boils down to the best ideas sometimes boil down to one single thought. I think that's one of the things that made this cover so successful was, what's the one story? I can tell it in a sentence. Latino Protestant congregations are growing and changing America. Such a simple idea. It's so simple. But then you can expound on that. And if everyone who wrote, if all of the scholars would write and had some place where they could send journalists, this is the 500 word version of what I'm doing. I mean, that's an op-ed. Yeah. Everyone wants to publish an op-ed, right? But just to make us more aware of what the good work that you're doing, give us story ideas. We want to know. It's just sometimes I don't have time, unfortunately, to call all of you and hear about the wonderful research you're doing, but I want to know.
And then,
No, I've thought about it too. I've done my share of sermon writing in my seminary days, so I've thought a bit about it. I'm very sensitive to the challenges of pastoral ministry. I mean, gosh, you look at your week, you're like writing a sermon, planning a Sunday school, visiting people in the hospital, doing a funeral, baptizing, doing a wedding, trying to be a normal human and sleep and eat and make sure your own needs are met and loving your family. So I think that if you have a moment to read the news, I know, I don't know what I want to say. I think it probably depends on your own, how your own church relates to public policy and how you see your own political role, your role in your own community, what matters to you. I think I would say the media can actually be a more positive resource than sometimes I hear it being understood as. If journalists are doing their job well, they are really truth-telling, and there's a lot of overlap there with pastoral ministry. You're not being a good reporter. I'm not talking about opinion journalism. I'm talking about straight reported news. If you're slanted or telling different sides of the story, so it can be easy sometimes to look for outside the media to look in and say, "Oh, this organization's bad," or they're telling one side of the story, but sometimes I think we only look for what we want to see in that, and I would hope that this is very hopeful, but I like to think there can be more trust in that relationship, and certainly maybe not everyone, but I would like to think that pastors could start to see more what they could take in a trustful relationship that could maybe something's happening in the news space that could help, or that sheds light on something that might challenge them in their own communities, more than it being an adversarial relationship.